Greetings everybody, and welcome back to Act 4 of Romeo and Juliet. Coming out of Act 3, a lot, watch the video if you haven't already. There's a lot happening in Act 3 that you want to make sure in terms of plot that you are caught up on. So we move right into Act 4 here. And it's a scene, a brief scene, with Friar Lawrence in County Paris talking about the upcoming marriage. Now, at this point in time, you have to understand, like any play, especially a Shakespearean play, it seems, these longer 5-act plays, the dramatic irony is so important. What we know as an audience, as I always say, is awesome. We know everything that's happening, right? We know what Romeo and Juliet are up to. We know the understanding that's been cultivated by all of the family members here and friends, right? So we're totally in the know. But a lot of people aren't, and Paris is one of those people. He doesn't know about the actual first marriage between Romeo and Juliet as conducted by Friar Lawrence, right? So he doesn't know about this, and Friar Lawrence is not going to tell him. Doesn't really feel the need here. It's not really a part of the plan. A couple things I just want to point out in this scene. Firstly, line 4, you say you do not know the lady's mind. What Friar is saying to Paris here is, you don't know how she feels about you? You don't know her true feelings? Obviously, Friar has an idea of who Juliet really likes here, and it's not Paris. And he's just bringing up that interesting point. You know, you want to marry this girl, and yet you don't really know her true feelings about you, right? Juliet has said some things to Paris, but nothing may indicate a really strong inclination that she feels toward him, right? So you don't know. Another line, I just noticed this last night as I kind of go through it, and I just covered this last semester, so things are pretty clear, right? This is line 8. Paris says, I totally understand, for Venus smiles not in a house of tears. Venus, the goddess of love, doesn't smile or have a amiable presence in a home that has just experienced death, the death of Tybalt, the death of a cousin here for Juliet. But all these lines are so ironic because, I'll read it again, for Venus smiles not in a house of tears. Love does not have its kind of presence within a home that is mourning. Not true. Romeo and Juliet are actually spending time together. Remember, the night into the morning, right? And we're going to see that scene here in just a little bit. So there has been, right, love, right? There has been intimacy, right? Physical intimacy in a house that is supposed to be mourning. As we move through, just to give you a little bit of a kind of indication of it, right? Notice that there's going to be this idea of minimal, right? Now that we're mourning, it shouldn't really be about this idea of excess, right? When we mourn the loss of those we love, who have tragically been taken from us, there needs to be this modesty, there needs to be this decency in place, right? And that is contrasted with what we see a lot in this play, which is overindulgence, right? Taking things to extremes, whether it be partying, love, violence, etc. What the father has said, Father Capulet, is, marry my daughter off because she's so depressed about Tybalt. The dramatic irony in place, we understand she's really depressed about Romeo. But that's his reason for pushing up the marriage. He thinks that the sooner we get this over with, Juliet will bounce back into a state of happiness. Juliet is doing more subversive replies, right, as she talks to Paris. Friar just said, are you sure you know how she actually feels about you? And so Paris, in these few lines that we have here, maybe that's what he's trying to figure out. Does this young girl actually like me, right? And she says some subversive lines, right? Lines that are meant to appease the requests of Paris, but at the same time appease her devotion to Romeo as well, right? That's the bigger priority here. Okay, so you can see that in some of the language here. Juliet, lines 30-31, and I wouldn't know this unless I had the text aids helping me out here, but she actually depreciates the beauty of her face here, right? When she says, the tears have got small victory by that, for it was bad enough before their spite. I know I look unattractive when I cry, but I was already unattractive to begin with. And I think that's an interesting line from this young girl, right? We haven't really seen that kind of an attitude, I guess you could say, a sense of herself up to this point. Maybe things are shifting for whatever reason here as we get into Act 4, right? The latter half of this play. I'm ugly, right? Maybe she's saying this because she doesn't want Paris to think fondly of her, right? Maybe I can turn him off a little bit, right? Maybe that's what she's trying to do. Paris makes an interesting line, has an interesting line here. Line 35, thy face is mine, and thou hast slandered it. When he says thy face is mine, he's really speaking to the idea of ownership, right? And there's a lot of truth to this, especially when you get back to like the traditional sense of marriage, right? And the whole ceremony of a father, you know, usually traditionally the father handing a daughter over, right, to a man, right, another man, almost like it's all just within this men's club, this idea of ownership, right, property. So I think we see that a little bit. We're always asking how much sympathy do we have for not just the major characters, but also the minor characters, Paris being a minor character. And so I just like to point these things out so you can really get your own feeling about all these different people. Paris gives her a holy kiss, right? Line 43. He says, keep this holy kiss, right? Remember that the one virtuous thing or good thing, I guess you could say, about the marriage, the possible marriage of Juliet and Paris, is that it was ordained and kind of agreed upon by all the parties here, right? We don't see Paris's family, which is interesting, but everybody agrees upon this marriage, right? It's given a certain kind of respect. I think for a moment, line 46, as the friar kind of responds to Juliet, I think he's ready to move on for a minute. I think he's ready to accept this marriage, and we'll do what we have to do with Romeo, right? We'll figure out a way to deal with that. But I think for a moment, he's ready to go along with it. But the problem here is Juliet will have none of that, right? Lines 53, 54, do thou but call my resolution wise, and with this knife I'll help it presently, right? So what she's essentially starting to say here is, if you don't help me, Friar Lawrence, right? If you don't help me prevent this marriage from happening, and I don't think she's creating too much wiggle room. I want to be with Romeo, the man I'm already married to, and you married us, right? There's our first marriage. And you can look at that with this kind of religious bond in mind, right? How strong that could be for some people, and maybe even for Juliet. If you don't help me find a resolution, she says, with this knife I'll help it presently. Romeo did the same thing. They're both quick to grab a blade, and the dramatic kind of enact this dramatic end to their life here, right? Very painful, right? Just as a kind of reminder there, but ready to take the knife. And she pulls out the knife in line 59, right? And she's talking about slaying herself in those lines, right? Ready to take the knife to her chest, abdomen, whatever it's going to be. Now, I like to pause here and just really think about the tension and the pressure that Juliet is applying to Friar Lawrence. Basically saying, if you don't play, she uses the word umpire, which is nice. If you don't play the umpire and fix this, right, then I am going to kill myself. It really puts the friar in a difficult place, right? So I think that's worth noting. Juliet's really putting him in a bind here. And she even says to him, like, as great as you are and however much help you've given to me or the community, right, that you're a part of, you couldn't help me, right, in my desperate situation. And she's saying, I think she's implying that there's a problem with that, right? You need to help me out right now. He responds, hold, daughter, I do spy a kind of hope, right, which craves as desperate an execution as that is desperate which we would prevent. The way of dealing with getting out of your jam is super desperate, but then again, your situation's desperate anyways, right? So maybe this is a fitting attempt that we can go for here. It's a fitting plan, right, that we can try to put into place. I think it's also, just to slow down a second, that overall theme and the paradox that we have here in Romeo and Juliet of young, beautiful people, compelling people, physically able, right? That's one of the beautiful things about youth. Take it from somebody who's starting to get into middle age, and you definitely start to realize at that age, when you've been around that long, that the body just doesn't really hold up over time, not like it does in its youth, right? When you're so physically capable, especially in your 20s and 30s and things like that, right? They have all of this, right? Juliet almost 14, Romeo probably, like I like to say 18 probably, right? Something like that. They have so much life ahead of them, so much vigor that they can put toward that life, and yet they're ready to just end it, right? It's an extreme. It's one extreme, it seems, all the way to death. All of these things returning to the earth and essentially pressing the off button, right? And being ready to be done with it all. So I think it's that paradox, right, that kind of continues throughout this entire text. All right. Juliet starts to give us a little bit of the soldierly sense in her, with the knife, right? Even just holding the knife. And we've seen people with rapiers and fighting in this play. And here we have a knife. In one way, it puts you on the status of a soldier, right? So there you go. So there's one way of understanding some of the soldierly characterization that we have for Juliet. Another is going to be this. This is line 78. Or I should say 77, 78. Oh, bid me leap rather than marry Paris. I'd rather leap from the battlements of any tower, jumping off into a swarm of troops right below. It speaks to the soldier, right? It speaks to a certain kind of bravery and action that is necessary, right, within one's life. It's pretty intense. She even, and also what we get here, this is lines 80 down. We really get another, some more detail added to the tomb reference, right? Being in that final tomb, surrounded by skeletons, right? Skeletons which represent a body exhausted, a body expired, a body that will sit there for the rest of time, right? To do nothing. And here we have these two people, Romeo and Juliet, with so much life inside of them, right? But in a way, ready to give it all up. All right. Friar has a plan. I'll read just a couple lines. This is 95, 96. When presently through all thy veins shall run a cold and drowsy humor, right? So whatever is going to, he's got a potion. The science to this, who knows? If you're a science person, I don't think it's worth putting in too much thought into what kind of poison this might be. I think they say like, I'm probably saying it wrong, but habona, right? Habana might be the poison that we have that represents an older time period. Nowadays, it's like ricin and some other crazy stuff, right? Who knows? Other things. But back then, you have a particular kind of poison here, and the idea is that it's going to run through her entire body, throughout her course throughout her body, and it's going to make her appear as if she has died. The breathing will be brought down to such a shallow breathing that it will almost be undetectable, right? Especially when you consider some of the standards back then, right? They couldn't really detect too much. So taking you back basically to taking you down into a state of death, decay, and then after that just kind of this inanimate nature, right, for the rest of time. It's going to last 42 hours. The time, the amount of time, the timing is crucial. I think it's one of those things you kind of roll your eyes a little bit with the writing of this play, but he had to find out a way to get this mishap in there, something that changes what could have been the desired outcome. And I think some of it's the timing here. It's other things too, I guess. There might be some other things, but definitely it's going to be the timing is completely thrown off. And later on, we'll see how this gets a mistaken word to Romeo, and he gets false information, right? because he wasn't aware of the time frame here. 42 hours. He's going to let Romeo, line 114, he's going to let Romeo know about this plan through letters. Right? This wasn't just texting and emails and all that stuff, obviously. You're going to have to send letters by foot, right? And hopefully these can get there. And basically says to Juliet, if you're brave enough and you take this potion, this is line 118, and this shall free thee from this present shame. If you are brave enough, then this potion and going through with this plan will fix your situation. But it is going to take a lot of bravery. And one kind of role, and it doesn't matter if you're a boy, girl, anything, right? Whatever you consider yourself, right? We're really talking about just the soldierly aspects of an individual, the ability to fight through something, overcome some kind of obstacle here, right? And you're going to see that with Juliet. She's going to have that bravery to continue forward with this plan. Act 4, Scene 2, getting right into it. I like how we always get the serving men. They're just so busy working and then thinking about food, right? I think that's kind of all it is. Working and thinking about food. They don't seem to really care about the dilemmas, the marriages, the gossip, whatever, of the upper class people that they work for. I don't think they really get into that. It's more just talking in the kitchen and sharing their own thoughts. I think it's criticizing them, but it's not worrying about their lives beyond that, right? It's usually just a criticism. The second serving man makes a line, 3 and 4. You shall have none ill, sir, for I'll try if they can lick their fingers. It's this almost like I guess it's a reference to an adage, which would be, don't trust somebody who can't test the results of their own labor, right? So like, it's hard. Teacher's not the best example. Best example is going to be a cook, right? Never trust a cook that doesn't eat their own food, right? So that's an easy one. But it could be anything. Don't trust the engineer who doesn't use the same bridge, right, that he just built, right? Don't trust him. It's anything to do with the kind of labor or thought or process or creativity, right, that you go through. But don't trust people if they don't do it for themselves, right? They don't try their own things or live by their own codes. Could be a way of understanding it. How that applies, I think, is kind of difficult, but I did want to point that out. Now, here's where we get the idea of minimalism, right? He says, line 10, Father Capulet, we shall be much unfurnished for this time. Unfurnished means going without needed supplies. So I think it gets us back to that overall theme of the haves and the have-nots, right? Some people live very unfurnished lives. Some people live very furnished lives, right? Incredibly furnished, right? Have things. Have our basic needs and more met, while some people struggle just to have those basic needs met and don't even have them, right? Some people don't even have those basic needs met. So we're talking about a spectrum of people living within a society, right? Where wealth and money and status obviously does play a big role. How big of a role does it play nowadays? I'll leave that up to you. Another one. Juliet talks about modesty in line 27. She's worried that maybe she overstepped some modesty, right? She's talking about Paris, right? Yes, I met him because, we want to know, are you ready for this marriage? Yes, I met him, but I didn't go over any modesty, right? I stayed very modest. One thing that does for us is brings up the theme of modesty. It's so important, right? I'm modest. I'm not egotistical. I don't have to brag about myself, right? I take things, in this kind of humble silence rather than this uproar of my own self-conceit, right? And people got to hear it. So that's important, just on a thematic level. But she's a liar in a way. She's talking about this idea of modesty with Paris. That's fine. Where's the modesty with Romeo? What happened to the modesty with Romeo? I think she talks about it in the balcony scene, right? That's on her mind. Have I gone too far? Am I, am I talking to him too much? Am I saying too much stuff to him, right? Physical, are we getting too close? What about modesty in Romeo? I'll let you think about that, right? You see it in her language. A little bit of a hypocrite, perhaps, or at least unaware, right, of her behavior. Capulet says our whole city is bound to Friar, right? because he's turned you around so much and you're ready to marry Paris, even though it's all part of this kind of plan, right? This plan that no one knows about. This plays upon dramatic irony, as does everything, but when they say we're all bound to the friar, I'll let you think about that. We know the friar's main intention seems to be, bringing these families together, which will happen. Consult the prologue, it tells us that. It's gonna happen, right? They're gonna come together. Are we grateful for what the friar has done, or in your opinion, are we rather critical of what he's done? Are we rather disapproving of what he's done, right? When we start to see the outcome here. All right. Another reference to the idea of lacking what is needed. Of course, they're talking about lacking what's needed for a wedding celebration. They don't have what they need, but it's just that basic idea, lacking versus having enough, right? Thinking about those two types of people in life and what kind of behaviors and attitudes that kind of dichotomous way of thinking about our lives leads to, right? What kind of people do we become in that type of a society? Last thing I'll mention here as we get out of scene 2, Father Capulet has a little bit of a kind of role switch here. Remember in the beginning he's trying to hold his sword and right, and that doesn't really seem to work too well. You see him, especially as the marriage approaches, with Paris, playing the housewife. He even uses that word in line 43, right? I will play the housewife for this one. So it's some interesting role reversals. Is Lady Capulet playing different roles? Well, what have we seen from her? Aggressiveness, right? So I don't know, maybe we're seeing interesting role reversals, right? Or this idea of a more aggressive type and female, male, kind of shifting in and out of those, right? Throughout this play, different characters. Okay, very good. All right, Act 4, Scene 3. This is where Juliet, it's a soliloquy. Mom says goodnight, and Juliet has a very important soliloquy here because it's right before she takes the potion, going into a 42-hour death-like sleep. All to get out of this marriage. Okay. The heat of life, line 16, is soon to be lost, right? So much vitality, so much heat and possibility, really, right? Like this, there's like a glowing ember, right? And a young person, right? And she's ready to put it out, right? The heat of life. And that's what the fears that she's having here, right? If I take this potion, what's going to happen? Line 19, this is her dismal scene and she must act alone. She has to have the strength and courage to do this on her own. I guess up to this point, there's been a lot of people that she could rely on, especially the nurse, We mentioned it last time where she says, cut the nurse off from my bosom. What a hypocritical thing to say when you think about what the nurse did for Juliet. Literally breastfed her, right, throughout her important years and even weaned her off, I think, breastfeeding, which is not an easy thing to do. So crazy for Juliet to say these things. She's all by herself now, and she has to do this on her own. So I think we see a strong Juliet here. This soliloquy represents, I think, a strong Juliet, at least in that regard, following through with this rather difficult action. She puts a knife by the bedstand on the night table, the nightstand. She puts a knife there, and she says, if the poison doesn't work and I wake up and I'm still alive, boom, ready to go, right? Ready to take my life with the knife. Now, one thing that I never understood is, after she takes the potion here in just a moment, nothing's ever mentioned about that knife. Like, nobody came into the room and after they were all kind of hysterics, nobody's going to say, wait a minute, that knife, like, why is there a knife there? Juliet normally doesn't sleep with a knife, unless she always does, which I doubt is the case, right? I don't think she does that. I don't think many of us do. But that's weird. It never gets touched upon. I just wanted to point that out. That's one thing I think Shakespeare slips on a little bit right there. Well, why are we talking about that knife? But that's her backup plan. Again, reverting to the very painful way to take the life. Notice a poison is a painless way for the most part. It may be a little bit of initial pain there, but nothing, especially when we think about injections and stuff, and for our animals when we take them to the vet on those sad days. It's a poison, essentially, that quickly kind of courses through the body and takes the life away, right? But now she wants to have this blade as a backup plan. All right, she has a lot of fears here, different fears. You can go through the lines of this soliloquy, right? But a lot about waking up and Romeo not being there, or stuck in a tomb, and suffocating nature of that. So you can kind of read on. I think I don't want to act like it's not something we should focus on. I'm kind of saving time. But it does represent her dealing with a lot of fears on her own. I want to highlight that, on her own, before finally you get to the end of this soliloquy. She drinks the poison, right? Right after she has this vision of Tybalt, right? And coming for Romeo, like trying to enact some revenge on Romeo. So that conflict, that horrible event, definitely at the forefront of her mind as she takes the potion. Not a good thing to think about, perhaps. All right, we move into Act 4, Scene 4. And we start with a little bit of back to excess, right? Bring more spices. You know, when we think about spices and sugar and some of these other things, this was, especially back in the day, back in the day, these were more, elite items, right? Not everybody, especially poor people, especially people who are living with barely enough to get by the necessities, they're not going to have the spices, the spice rack. Get out the spice rack, right? Another thing they're not going to have, the next line, dates and quinces. But these are like pastry items that, come on, I love donuts. If there's glazed donuts around, I'm going to eat one or two, probably two. But are they necessary? No, definitely not, right? They represent a certain indulgence and kind of excess, and here they are trying to get into a state of excess as the wedding comes up, right, on this very day. All right, we find out a little bit of exposition, importantly, about Father Capulet. Lady Capulet, his wife, says, you have been a mouse hunt in your time, and thankfully the text aid gives me a little bit insight into that, which would be a womanizer, right? So Father Capulet is a womanizer, somebody who kind of, I guess you could say, chases after women, takes advantage of women, and I don't think it's the idea of treating women very nicely or giving them maybe a respect that they deserve, right? A womanizer. And then it's the negative characterization for Father Capulet. We already know he's rich, and he's kind of lured on by grandeur and ceremony, but now we're also seeing that he's lured on by physical contact outside of his own marriage here, right? He's been married a large part, probably forever, right? And yet he still could be this kind of guy, it seems, who has been having affairs and keeping up with other women. The county's bringing the music, right, which represents another kind of indulgence of this earth, right? The music that we listen to, the music that we dance to, right? The nurse, as she's coming in to wake Juliet out of bed, right, this morning, and not see the knife. Okay, anyways. She's basically just, it's very sexually oriented, right? That's what she's talking about. He's not going to let you rest, meaning he's going to want to be intimate with you, right? And the nurse brings us back to one of those earthly temptations, right? Which is the physical, right? It's not just the gold and the money and the balconies and the homes and the whatever and the pools. It's not just that stuff. It's also the physical. And I feel like the nurse, they say she's vulgar. You get a lot of, the nurse tends to be vulgar, but I think she's also to tie us to that physical nature of who we are, right? Those things that tempt us here on earth. I think the nurse does represent that. We see that influence, right? And she has a very strong influence relationship with Juliet, so we think about that. Very good. Now, as we see the endless, what seems like the endless wailing of the nurse and Lady Capulet as they realize that Juliet is not responsive, right? Appearing dead. It seems super tragic, like, oh, Juliet, right? However, I guess, and I get this more through text aids and such, maybe performances of it. It's supposed to be a little bit comedic, only in the sense that we know Juliet's not really dead, right? We know that she's just in this deep slumber that no one can detect. So in a way, it's funny to see the nurse. Not funny to me, I guess, but I guess if you see it perform, maybe funnier than if you're reading it. But it's supposed to be a little bit funny, the lamenting that we get here, all right? Death. More personification of death, especially as Father Capulet walks into the room and just saying, death has taken all my kids. Death has taken my daughter here, right? Death will not let me speak. I don't even have words, is what he's saying. Line 61. Death is a powerful force or entity, right? In walks County Paris with Friar Lawrence and the musicians. And it's very ironic to have musicians show up because we're not really going to need celebratory music here, right? Which music sometimes tends to be, right? Celebratory, exciting, right? Energetic. Not needed based on a dead Juliet here. Yep. Capulet keeps on going with the personification of death, line 66, line 65, 66. There she lies, flower as she was, deflowered by him. Deflowered meaning virginity taken, right? By death, right? So something that he comments on, everything is death. Life, living, all is deaths. And I do think this is a sobering statement, right? This is that whole Ash Wednesday thing, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. It's reminding us that no matter how much pleasure something of the living within this living world, within this earthly domain, how much pleasure it brings to you, it belongs to death. It has an expiration. It will eventually be there, right? To no longer be, right? In this celebratory way, right? Like the way we should think about life, I think. Life is not easy, as you all know. We all have our own ups and downs that occur throughout our lives, but maybe we do want to celebrate it as much as possible, but can that go too far? Can that celebration go too far where we forget that it will eventually go back to death, right? It leads to some interesting kind of break-off topics such as ageism, right? How we look at elderly populations in our society. Do we just keep them at an arm's length, continuously saying that will never be us, I'll never be that old, I'll never have those issues, right? That those ailments as I get older? Or do we embrace and see through those perspectives, right? It leads to other topics here, but I love that line. It's sobering. Perhaps one of the most sobering statements we've had up to this point. Life, living, all is deaths. And it comes from Father Capulet, who is the prime kind of representation of wealth and status in this text. There's Montague, but he's barely in the story. And we can analyze that, right? A little bit. But such an important character because he represents the top of the pyramid, right? As the saying would go. Lady Capulet, just to pull out some diction here, line 74, pilgrimage, which really represents a religious journey here. Are we looking at Juliet? Is she going, even in this fake death, this poison, this potion that she has taken? Is this a redemptive state for Juliet? You know, it makes me piece together some things like, I'm not beautiful, I don't care about, she's getting thin, she doesn't care about the body. Has she already started going through a redemptive state into this sleep? Maybe the language suggests. She even says, but one poor and loving child. A reference to Juliet, and the word used here is poor. Poor could be, meaning circumstantially, right? That she's in a poor situation. But it could bring us back to actual poor, right? Poverty, poor people, a state of mind, a state of living, right? Paris, kind of important lines. Everyone's just like yelling out words they feel, right? Kind of singular words that they feel here. Beguiled, divorced, wrong, spited, slain. I think that a lot of this shows us that Paris sees this rather as a transaction that has soured to his own loss, right? I've been cheated, beguiled meaning cheated of hopes, right? Like I had something to gain from this. Notice it's not like, oh my gosh, Juliet, you poor child. Like, what's going on here? You know, we were supposed to get, like, not thinking about her. Like, what's going on? He immediately thinks about his own skin, right? And we call this, I didn't even know what this word existed until like 3 years ago, invidious, right? You see the invidiousness of Paris somewhat here, that he's only thinking about himself and now he's been cheated out of something, right? Wronged. I've been wronged by this young girl's spontaneous death. What a self-centered way to think about it. Spited, right? This was to spite me and make me angry and miserable. What about this girl, right? Capulet follows up. These, I think, are harder to kind of make sense of, but despised, distressed, hated, martyred, killed. You know, without mentioning too much there, maybe that's taking us through the whole idea of the families, the sense of pride and respect that armor a family from other families, right? And how we all get caught up in this stuff. You know, once we start having martyrs, it just leads to more people identifying with a cause, right? And then they fight for it as well. So it's really the continuance. Could be that idea. Friar Lawrence, who is the only person in this room that knows that Juliet has taken this potion, right, and is probably sleeping, he tries to make them all feel better about things. And he says, listen, she's in heaven. Best place you can be. That's what he says, right, basically. So let's be happy about that simple idea. And remember, very religious world, whether it's Shakespeare's world, then with the time he's writing, or Italy and Verona at this time, right? Definitely super religious world. So they would definitely believe in heaven and all these things, whether you do or not, or whether I do or not, right? Just giving you the context of what we have here. So that's a powerful thing to say, considering that context. She's in heaven now. He also says you wanted to see her advanced through marriage, right? This idea of like going up a mountain. Think of Romeo's name, Montague. It's all about a mountain, getting higher, right? And that's why getting up on that balcony is almost like climbing a mountain for him in some respects. But advanced through marriage, going up, right? Some of us like to think of marriage like that, right? There I go. But what he's saying here is don't feel bad. It might not be marriage, but she's advanced all the way to heaven. Think about that mountain, right? That she's gone up. So helping them quickly, right? Really for the sake of his own good, because he wants to see this plan through, but trying to get them to accept the situation, right? Capulet speaks to what we find commonly in Shakespeare across many of his plays, especially his tragedies, the death-marriage nexus, where we were really prepared for a marriage, and now all of a sudden we're preparing for a funeral, right? And we've gone back and forth. Funeral for Tybalt and Mercutio, essentially, and then we have this marriage, and now based on the plan with this dead Juliet, now we're back to a funeral, right? So the nexus, almost how one inescapably leads to the next, right? All right. Something I noticed is taken out of some versions of Act 4, Scene 4 is Peter getting into it with the musicians, right, at the end. What Peter says is, whoa, this is a sad situation. Could you please play me something that is a bit more carefree, right? Play me something that's going to ease my heart and my mind and not remind me of the sorrow that I should be feeling because of the loss of Juliet here, right? And what's happened to this family in mere, 30 minutes, right, of discovering this. The musician says, no, we don't want to do that, right? And then Peter says, then I'm going to hit you, right? And of course, they're playing upon words here of musicians, but then it's almost like the direct behaviors of soldiers, right? I'll give it to you soundly, like through sound, but I'll give it to you soundly also means I'm going to hit you pretty hard, right? So we see the use of that language that brings together, and this has been happening the whole time. I think one thing I'd like to do with the series of these lectures that other people out there and other teachers, professors might not be doing is really solidify some major themes. And one is definitely going to be not necessarily the lover here, but when you think about love, you also think about music and language, right? It's a big part of it. Speaking to each other, right? Trying to attract each other, right? But that is being blended ever so often with the soldier, right? The fighting, the physical capacity of aggression here, right? So we see both worlds being brought together here for sure. He says he'll insult them, and then it quickly, right, leads to this idea of we will physically have blows. Right? Line 143, Peter says, "I'll ray you and fa you," right? Which just means hit, right? I will hit you, right? But he's blending it with the idea of musical notes here. Peter kind of gets the last laugh here. It's interesting because, and we're reminded of this through their dialogue, they're all just servants in this house. So Peter sees them as the lesser of servants here, right? The musical, they're called minstrels in this context, which means musical servant basically of a home. They don't really get paid. They just have to play, and then they get their room and board probably. And he has the last laugh just saying how broke these men must be, right? They have no money to their name, right? Maybe he actually is able to acquire more money than they are. We end with just the idea of getting some free food, right? Staying for dinner, right? Notice they could care less about Juliet. They're not talking about this young girl. They probably barely know who she is. It's always just getting back to the basic needs, right? In this case, food. They don't really care about the rich folk. That is the end of Act 4. Act 5 to come. This play just keeps on a boulder rolling down the hill forward. There's still lots to come. There's still lots of things to happen with the plot here as we get closer and closer to the crypt, right, is where we're headed. Thank you, and I hope you have a beautiful day.